You have to have a positive vision of the future. Rather than saying, if the woke are saying all these people are evil and the anti-woke saying all these people are idiots, there's no creative, positive future there. And you guys, the Jesus lovers, you have your answers to that. You are very clear about that, as I know.
So imagine that Shakespeare wanted to make himself known to Hamlet. He could write himself into the play.
Do you not think it's quite a weird thing for Shakespeare to do, though?
Apparently it's happened. So Dorothy Sayers did this in a detective novel. She sort of fell in love with her protagonist. And decided to write herself into the story so they could actually meet.
Is this a live conversion? Is this what you got me on the show for? Just to see
conversion of Constantine. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Constantine was, of course, the emperor who brought Christianity to the Roman Empire.
Exactly.
So
312.
You want me to follow in his footsteps, I take it.
Hello and welcome to Speak Life. My name is Glenn. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. We are in a series called The Way Back. Is there a way back to Christian faith in our post-Christian moment? We happen to think so, and we've been tracking the exploits of Konstantin Kisin for many years, actually now, and he is the co-host of the Triggernometry podcast, which is well worth your time, and so many of the same guests that you'll have seen on Speak Life have also been on the Triggernometry podcast. Konstantin is a stand-up comedian, and he's also written a new book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, and he joins me on the line from his Triggernometry studios. Hello, Konstantin.
Hello, mate. How are you?
I'm really well, thank you. I have loved tracking all the sorts of stuff that you've been doing over the last many years. I guess you came onto my radar screen, as you did on many people's radar screens, when you turned down a comedy gig all those years ago, and what was it that they said that you weren't allowed to make certain kinds of jokes? Who were you not allowed to offend?
So they, having seen me perform, they then sent me an invitation to perform at their charity night, and they said that in order to perform I had to sign a behavioral agreement contract.
Wow.
Which said that they have a zero tolerance policy on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism, and it also said that all jokes must be respectful and kind.
Which is easy. I mean, that's just, an open goal for comedians.
Exactly. And
you sort of sent a tweet out about this and went to bed, and the internet kind of exploded over it. What happened next?
So what happened next, very briefly summarized, is the story became the second most read story on the BBC News website on the day that the then Prime Minister Theresa May was nearly removed from office by her own party. So it was Prime Minister nearly removed from office by her own party, and then no-name comedian turns down unpaid charity gig from some too-big college in second place, which was when I started to realize that maybe I wasn't the only one that had concerns about the direction society was going, particularly around free speech and sort of making the wrong joke and saying the wrong thing, that I wasn't the only one that was sort of feeling something odd in the water, because I got thousands of messages from people, and the gist of what they were all saying was essentially like, a lot of people now live with the feeling that they've signed that contract in their own life. So when they go to work, they worry about saying the wrong thing or making the wrong joke. The same at school, the same in college. And we were just we've got some young people doing a bit of an internship for us here at the studio today. We were just having lunch, and they were talking to us about how, teachers will say to them, well, you're not allowed to have that opinion and stuff like that. So that was when I really realized that we were it wasn't just me and a bunch of other people being crazy. There was actually a real social feeling about this issue that was going on across the country.
And I think a lot of people then realized that it wasn't just them, and the popularity around your story kind of reflected the fact that there's kind of a silent majority on this, that we're all feeling the chilling of speech and the pressure to conform and say the right things. Do you get the feeling that this belief in free speech is a kind of a silent majority issue, or are we have we lost the notion that people can disagree and that's okay?
Yeah, I don't know. I think both can be true. I mean, the reason the silent majority is silent is it's worried about expressing its opinions.
Yeah.
So there's that element to it. And on the other hand, I think as social media has become the place where these conversations are being had, or not only that, but actually the place that influences the way that these conversations are being had elsewhere. I mean, one of the examples that really stuck out for me is, I sometimes in the evening, just as I'm unwinding, I'll open YouTube and watch various things, and you go down the wormhole as we all do. And I came across a parliamentary debate between John Prescott and William Hague, in probably the late 90s, maybe it would have been early noughties. Mm-hmm. And it is night and day to the way that we have political debates now. And they were just as robust back then, but there wasn't the animus. There wasn't the feeling like you were trying to destroy people. There was an element of play. There was humor. And in that particular occasion, people will remember John Prescott was a working class trade union labor guy. And William Hague, although I think he went to a grammar school, he certainly comes across as a very posh, almost, he sounds like an old Etonian type of character. Right. And the entire exchange was William Hague basically taking the piss out of John Prescott for not being able to pronounce words properly. And John Prescott's reply to that wasn't, I am a member of the oppressed working classes. It was like, on this side of the house, we may get the words wrong, but we get the judgment right. In other words, it was a debate, it was a discussion, and both sides understood that they were not out to destroy each other. What I think increasingly happens in the world of social media is it's all about pandering to the most extremist part of your base or your audience. Mm-hmm. And so nowadays politicians go into the House of Commons not to have a debate in the House of Commons, but to pander to their people on Twitter. And as a result of that, I think you end up with that sort of toxification of the debate in the politics, but then also in the media, of course, and elsewhere, because it's just all attempting to pander to social media where division and polarization and hate thrive.
Yes, well, we've always had division and polarization and hate, but I guess one thing is that social media has absolutely supercharged that sort of tribal identity thing. One other thing, I guess, and this has been part of your journey on the Triggernometry show, is the lines across which we disagree have changed, such that your old school Labour and your old school Tory would be engaged in discussions about class and kind of social mobility and issues like that. One issue that's changed, I guess, has been David Goodhart's division between the somewheres and the anywheres, and I guess this division between those who see their identity as mainly built upon the local and the embodied, and the majority of Brits have grown up within like 10 miles of where they were born, as opposed to the globalists and those who consider, the anywheres, who consider themselves sort of citizens of the world. Tell me about how that and its interplay with Brexit in particular has kind of shaped things.
Well, Brexit predates Triggernometry by a couple of years, actually. Triggernometry only started in 2018. Okay. But one of the reasons that we started it was, I'm a first-generation immigrant, and Francis, his mother, came here from Venezuela, and her father, who was an English guy, married her in the 80s when, marrying a dark-skinned immigrant wasn't necessarily the done thing. And we both felt that the way that the conversation was being had, as to remain anyways, Francis and I both, I would argue, we just felt that the conversation, the way it was being had, was A, inaccurate, and B, frankly, insulting. I mean, I've lived in this country since 1995. The idea that half of the population voted to leave the European Union because they hate immigrants is just factually incorrect, and frankly quite insulting to a huge number of people who are incredibly receptive and tolerant and open towards people from other places, but at the same time had a desire to express their political opinion on that issue. And even if some of them were concerned about immigration, it's not racist to be concerned about immigration. I mean, the unspoken truth is a lot of first and second and third generation immigrants are actually not pro unlimited levels of immigration and are certainly against illegal immigration, not least because they came here by following all the rules. And that, I'm afraid, is kind of, I think, where a big part of the problem with where we are at the moment is, where we essentially punish people who follow all the rules, and we reward people for not following the rules. And I'll give you a very personal example. My wife and I had our first child a year ago, and it was his first birthday a few weeks ago. And my mum wanted to come and spend a couple of weeks with us, partly to celebrate it. And my mum filled in her paperwork, made the application. I said I would pay for all the expenses that she incurred and whatever. This is a woman who's been to the UK over the last 30 years, at least 20 times. She has a full-time job. She's got children that she looks after back in the country that she lives. Her visa application is denied at the very same time that we have tens of thousands of people coming into the UK on small boats across the channel, and we don't know who they are or why they're here. And that is kind of, I'm afraid, the big picture elsewhere. If you look at crime, I think we're in a very similar position where it feels like if your car gets broken into or your house gets burgled, the best you're going to get is a crime reference number from the police. But they're quite keen to, if you push over an Extinction Rebellion protest, or if you say the wrong thing on Facebook or whatever, the police will be there pretty quickly. So I just think across a whole load of areas, we've started to punish and demonize people who are expressing perfectly normal opinions, and on the other hand, we're rewarding people who are doing things that they shouldn't be rewarded for doing.
And so, I guess your channel is discussing things like freedom of speech and those sorts of issues. The difference between elite discourse about subjects like Brexit and also coming through into 2020 and the pandemic. Again, I would say that your channel had a massive boost in terms of people starting to question narratives. And one of your chapters of your book, I believe it began as a tweet thread, and then it became a video, and then it's a real standout chapter in your book about the breakdown of trust. Was the pandemic kind of a really crystallizing moment for you in terms of thinking about who can we trust and why?
It was a crystallizing moment in different ways for us. So first and foremost, it was the thing that forced us to take trigonometry full time. And during the pandemic, one of the things that happened is we had to leave the comedy club where we'd started the show from. And at that point, what we decided was to actually, for Francis and our executive producer Anton to move in together, and for me to be there half the week for us to record the show. So first of all, on a practical level, it forced us to get more serious about what we were doing. And then, yes, you're right, having both supported the first lockdown because we felt we didn't know what was going on, and it was not unreasonable to show a little bit of caution for a couple of weeks, which is, if you remember, what we were told. And then suddenly we find ourselves a year and a half into lockdown, and you have to have the vaccine, otherwise you're not going to be able to get a job if you're working in the medical field, or all sorts of other things going on. You're not going to, the government saying young people aren't going to be able to go out, and you see these polls where like 20% of the public thinks that, nightclubs should be permanently shut down irrespective of COVID. Whatever percentage of people think you should be forced to wear a mask on public transport irrespective of COVID, and by the way, irrespective of whether masks actually stop the spread of COVID. And that point, I think, the most common comment Francis and I get when we get recognized on the street is, "You got me through lockdown." And that's because we were very clear that what was happening was just an abuse of power. It was scared people making bad decisions, and we weren't having any of it.
I've heard somebody describe our current culture as not so much a post-truth culture as a post-trust culture, and you can see that breakdown in institutional trust happening left, right, and center. And so I was very interested in, obviously, another thing where you might have come across people's radars is your Oxford Union speech earlier this year, where you talk about the environment quite a lot.
I believe there are those of you here who are woke, who are open to rational arguments, so let me make one. We are told that your generation cares more than any other about one issue in particular, and that issue is climate change. There is only one thing we can do in this country to stop climate change, and that is to make scientific and technological breakthroughs that will create the clean energy that is not only clean, but also cheap.
And at the same time, I noticed you put out tweets like this one in January of this year. You said, the future is not woke, the future is not anti-woke, the future is post-woke. And that's fascinated me. And I just wonder, could you kind of talk us through that? Like, to you, what does woke mean, and what does anti-woke mean? And then,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, it might take us on a long journey, but briefly, I mean, the chief problem I have with radical progressivism, which we call wokeness, is that it's, as someone who always thought of himself as liberal, it is undoing key, essential, fundamental aspects of the liberal project. And one of them is the idea of equality of opportunity, the idea that human beings are supposed to be treated as equals. And it is replacing that with a whole set of extremely old, extremely crude, and extremely discredited, at least in my view, ideas from which we rightly moved away. One of those was the idea that your skin color or your ethnicity is important in deciding how you should be treated by society, or how you should be treated under the law, or how you should be treated in employment, or how you should be treated in whatever other field in which you come into contact with other human beings, right? That, to me, is an extraordinarily backward step. The idea of re-racializing society and saying, you know, this group of ethnically based people, they should be treated like this, and this group of people who would have this kind of color should be treated differently, to me, is an extraordinary and very dangerous backward step that has the potential to backfire massively, particularly because if you have the situation that we've had in the past where it's a minority that is being treated as second-class citizens, you can sustain that for quite a long time, and eventually with enough pushback and enough hard work, you're probably going to overturn that. But if you start to get to the point where words like white or male or straight come to be used as pejoratives, you are building in quite a dangerous situation for the future, because you are essentially, discriminating against may be true on some circumstances, but more broadly, you're sort of demonizing the majority. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a recipe for a healthy society going forward. So that's the first part. What flows out of that, if you want to jump in, please do.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we'll talk about anti-woke in a second. Let's talk about woke for a moment. And then somebody comes back and they say, well, this is just redressing decade after decade of injustices, and it's not a level playing field, and therefore let's think about the black community in America, for instance. Mm-hmm. It's not as though you abolish the slave trade and everything's fine. It's not as though you simply have civil rights activism and everything's fine. There's redlining happening across states, and there are all sorts of systemic injustices that require, if you do believe in equality, that require a bit of a leg up, and they also require a bit of reflection on the part of the dominant culture about ways that they are perpetuating injustices. What do you say to that?
Well, it's not true. So if you look at, first of all, there's no such thing as the black community. Mm-hmm. Doesn't exist. There's no black community in America, and there's no black community in the UK. African Americans, actually who are first generation immigrants from Africa, that's people, Ghanaian Americans, Nigerian Americans, do way better than the local white and black population in the United States. Jamaican Americans do better in terms of education and earnings and so on than the local population and the white population in America. Japanese Americans do better. Chinese Americans do better. Korean Americans do better. You can go down the list. So the same is true in the UK. People who have come from Africa, first generation or second generation, are incredibly successful in our education system. They do incredibly well. The Caribbean community is the one that is suffering and struggling. And so, first of all, you have to disentangle race from what we're actually talking about, which is it's a class issue. Poor people get a worse outcome in life than people who have money, and people who have a certain attitude to getting ahead in education, who teach their children certain values, who have a certain family structure. That's really where you start if you're actually trying to solve these problems. And so from the perspective of attempting to right the wrongs of the past, you're not righting the wrongs of the past by telling black people they're oppressed. The way you right the wrongs of the past is to improve educational outcomes in the inner city, to help families stay together in the inner city, and so on and so forth. There's actually practical outcomes, and we've interviewed people on the show, people like Tony Sowell and Catherine Birbal Singh and a bunch of others from the so-called black community who will tell you the exact opposite of what you're being told on TV. And that's because they actually work in inner city communities, educate children in those communities, and what they will tell you is those children need our values, education, family stability. And that is the way a lot of these problems get solved. So that's the first part. The second part is, I do not believe that the solution, the central tenet of radical progressive ideology when it comes to race is expressed by this guy called Ibram Kendi. And he says, the solution to past discrimination is present discrimination. In other words, if there was discrimination in the past, the only way to fix it is by discriminating against other people in the present. What these people never seem to ask themselves is, what will be the solution when present discrimination that you are applying now becomes past discrimination? Mm-hmm. When people catch up to the fact that what you call positive discrimination is not positive at all. In America, they have a situation where, for example, if you're an Asian student or a Jewish student, you have to get a way higher grade than a black student or a Latino student to get into the same college. How is that fixing the problem of racism? It's not. And so I don't believe that positive discrimination is possible. There's no such thing. You're just discriminating against someone else. What we have to do is eliminate discrimination entirely, and then people have to succeed or fail on their own merits. That's right. It. I'm a first-generation immigrant with dark skin in this country. I was called a Paki when I was at school. I didn't die. I'm still here. I run a successful YouTube channel. I've made a great life for myself here. And if you want to do that, the opportunity is there if you want to take it.
Very good. And people can check out my interview with Catherine Birbal Singh, which is on our channel as well. I'm very much looking forward to going and visiting her Michaela school in Brent later on this year. But okay, so
that's the woke.
Yeah,
that's the woke, right?
That's the woke.
And
now
the
there's
woke,
the anti-woke. Go on.
The radical progressive mindset is a fundamentally destructive, deconstructive mindset, which has nothing to offer in terms of solutions. It's about tearing down the founding principles of, in my opinion, Western civilization. So that's what they want. It's a kind of anguish-based primal scream. Society isn't the way I want it to be. Let's tear it all down and start again. And as you know, in an Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, I make the point that this isn't the first time this rallying cry has been put out there by people who didn't know what they were doing. In response to that, you naturally generate, and in my opinion, an equally, potentially in the future at least, equally dangerous and equally destructive force, which is anti-wokeness, which is the other side of that same abyss, if you like. You get a bunch of people who are angry about what is being done to their society, angry about what's being done to their community, angry about the shutting down of free speech, angry about the re-racialization of society, and rightly want to express that. The problem with that, and I certainly would consider that I have been on a journey through that process, if you like. So I'm not saying the anti-woke are all idiots and they're all doing the wrong thing, because the journey of my life and the journey of trigonometry has been through that process too, and going, look, I don't like what's going on. Let's work out what it is. Let's speak out against it. Let's challenge it robustly, which you have to do. My point when I talk about getting to a post-woke place is you have to have a positive vision of the future. Rather than saying, if the woke are saying all these people are evil and the anti-woke saying all these people are idiots, there's no creative, positive future there. It's people arguing with each other about how wrong each other is without offering people. And I think what we have to start to think about, and you guys, the Jesus lovers, you have your answers to that. You are very clear about that, as I know. But as you also know, most societies in the West certainly are becoming more secular over time. So the answers that you are offering may maybe a harder sell for some people, in my opinion. We have to also have a secular offering to people that says, look, you don't have to believe in God and go to church, but here are some of the things that traditionally will give your life meaning and purpose. And we're not saying you must do this. These are the 7 commandments of secularism. But if you want a good life, historically speaking, here are some of the ways that people have done that in the past. And that is the conversation I'm interested in having. It's a very difficult one, because in our hyper-liberal society, the moment you start to make any generalized statement about any group of people, everyone has a meltdown. But yes, I think on balance, having family and having children gives your life meaning and purpose in a way that not having them is unlikely to do. Doesn't mean everyone should have children. Doesn't mean I want to force anyone to have children. But generally speaking, that will do it. The pursuit of a meaningful career that makes you feel like you're contributing to the world in some kind of positive way, that will almost certainly provide some of the meaning and purpose you want. A healthy family dynamic, men and women are different. And so while, of course, I'm not suggesting women should get back in the kitchen in any sense of the word at all, we have to recognize that there are differences between us, and how we coexist, particularly within the family unit, isn't going to be this sort of genderless dream that people imagine, because our brains are wired differently, our psychology is different. My wife and I have spent 20 years reading and working on our relationship and on ourselves to understand those differences and to benefit from them, because they're mutually complementary, something that, this stupid moronic battle of the sexes that's been imposed on us from outside wouldn't want you to believe. So those are just some starting points for some very basic principles we can talk about. And then you add on top of that the thing we've been talking about already, which is healthy discussion and disagreement is fine and good. But we must remember we are part of a society, and yes, we can have our arguments about all sorts of political issues, but we've got to remember that we are a nation of people who have common interests, and so we mustn't destroy ourselves in the process of trying to work out who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah, no, I can get on board with so much of that. Interesting, you talk about the male and female thing. Let me just zero in on that just for a second. We had Louise Perry on the channel.
Oh, excellent.
Last year, as you've had on Triggernometry as well.
Huge fan of hers.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of hers as well. And as I asked her this question, I said, are you nervous about pressing into the differences between men and women? Because as a Christian, I can say, look, on page 1 of the Bible, it says male and female are made in God's image. They are both equal in the eyes of God. That is a given. Now you can press into the differences without actually losing this equality that's at the most profound level possible. If you ditch the Bible, and if you ditch that sort of transcendent sense of the absolute utter equality of male and female, do you worry that pressing into the differences between male and female might actually make you lose the equality? And she paused and she said, it's all from Christianity, isn't it? And we had a great conversation about that. And she said on Jordan Peterson's podcast that feminism has been, or just to champion the equal rights of women, has been a profoundly Christian thing. And I would say it's a profoundly Christian thing in that you've got the God-given equality, which actually enables you to say, and we're different, and we don't therefore need to shape our lives in exactly the same way in order to uphold equality. And you've got that interesting interplay of equality and diversity, which I see flourishing in a Christian kind of context. How do you see a problem in a secular kind of context? I worry whether without this idea of the image of God and everybody being equal in that sense, you just get this punch-up between those who really go for equality, meaning uniformity, and those who go for distinction and particularity, and that just leads to sort of a kind of a war of the genders.
That's interesting. I think it really fundamentally depends on how you define the meaning of equality. What I mean by equality is two things. Number one, what you're talking about, which is in a religious context, you would say that everybody has the spark of divinity within them, and therefore we're all, by virtue of being human, we're all worthy of dignity and respect and all of that. Mm-hmm. Which I understand it's easier to get there from religion, but I also don't think you need religion in the modern society to get there, right? We could just say that's what we mean by equality, and therefore people shouldn't be treated worse or better because of their sex or the color of their skin or so on. However, I'm afraid the path that we've gone down is we are so traumatized by the imposition of gender roles on men and women in history that we are unable to accept the truth, which is that there is an element of those gender roles that is quite natural and naturally evolved. My wife becoming a mother has changed her attitude to everything dramatically, and she is a completely different human being as a result. With me, it has also changed me, but it's actually made me more of the gender role that I had in the past. So, whereas we were both kind of working and very hardworking and driven in our careers before, her response to becoming pregnant and then having a child has been to basically, I don't think she wants to do a little bit of her work stuff, but that isn't where her mind is at. She certainly doesn't want to be going out there and, bringing in loads of money. That's really not where her focus is. With me, it's been the other way. Like, I'm much more, gender role
typical
set, typical, right. If you like. Yeah. I'm out there going like, I got to provide for my family. I got to do this. I got to do that. And those differences, as I said earlier, they're complementary. Of course, when you've got an infant, a person with breasts and milk and a naturally evolved ability to know exactly what that infant needs in that moment. Like, my wife looks at my son and she can know that he's about to have a pee or a poo, without, he can't speak, he can't say anything. He often, she can just tell. I can't. Yeah, right? Yeah. So those differences make particularly the rearing of children much easier than pretending that we should all do the same thing and be the same. But I guess to come back to your primal question, do you need religion for that? I personally don't believe so. I just think we have to be clearer about what we mean by equality. Although, of course, I would acknowledge that if you have a sacred text, whether it is religious or some other sacred text, the Constitution or whatever, it's easier if you have something that's embedded and unique, universally observed, to impose something like that on everybody. Yeah,
there was a Russian philosopher. You can help me with the pronunciation. Vladimir Solovyev. He said, "Man descended from apes. Therefore, we must love one another." As a kind of a parody of, is there a way of grounding kind of a universal morality in a purely secular worldview? Man descended from apes. What follows from that? Does it follow from that therefore we have inviolable human rights? Does it follow from that we must look after the weak of our society? Does it follow from that we should prize liberty and choice and autonomy? Does it follow from that there are these values of compassion or progress or those sorts of things? And I guess I just come back to why should we want to have an ethic of equal human dignity and value across all people if there isn't something that's already there, such that we recognize an equality to all people, rather than impose equality as a sort of a political program?
Well, I mean, you're no disrespect, but there's an element of linguistic games there. Or maybe it's not linguistic games. Sorry, Glenn, I take that back straight away. Your worldview means that you experience what you are saying as recognizing as opposed to imposing. But to a non-religious person, you saying, I have Holy Scripture here that says this, is the same imposition that a secular imposition would be, which is, I have a reason here that says to me that we should have equality between men and women. I think we've just got ourselves confused more than anything about what we mean by that term. And if we can disentangle ourselves from that misunderstanding, there's a bigger conversation about, which is, where do we get this idea in the West from? And yes, of course it's from religion. Of course it is. There's no argument about that. My point, from a much more practical perspective, as you probably, if you watched my conversation with Jordan Peterson, you know that I'm much more empirically minded about these things. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in how we make society better now. I recognize that there are a lot of people of my generation in particular, who are sort of children of Hitchens and Dawkins, you're going to struggle to get a lot of us, and particularly younger people, to go to church on a Sunday. So to me, the question is, how do you take some of the good things about religion, and it's not just the Christian religion, by the way, there are other religions that have useful ideas about how society should be run, and how do you offer them to people in a way that's enticing, because that is probably what's going to make society better. So from an equality perspective, I just think it's demonstrably true that we live in a healthier society if we treat each other in that way. Historically speaking, the transition towards that has been to the benefit of both men and women, in my opinion. Now, we sometimes overdo that, right? But empirically speaking, I would argue that's an observable fact. If it comes from Christianity, that's great, but you're not going to get everybody to buy into it.
But so I guess my argument is not that you need a holy scripture to tell you that each person is equal, any more than you need the IKEA manual to figure out how to assemble the table. But I would say those four legs and that flat top do indeed form a table. I don't need that scripture to tell me what the table is, but there is a reality of tableness that those sort of pieces assemble into. And I would say by parallel, I'm not saying you need Genesis chapter 1 to believe in the equality of all people, but I would say Genesis chapter 1 is describing a moral fact that is there before anyone comes to claim it as that fact. So, I don't know if you've been watching Succession, but Logan Roy in season 3, people sort of ask him whether he's worried about legal consequences to whatever nefarious activities he's getting up to in season 3. And he says, the law is just politics and politics is just people. And at that stage, everyone watching that wants to say, no, the law is not politics. There's got to be something above politicians that can be bought off, as Logan Roy buys off politicians. There's got to be something above the social, above the human, I would say, to say that this is true, whether this society claims it to be true or not. And I guess that's not an argument about, okay, a holy scripture needs to come in and tell us these things, but it is a fact of, it is a claim about what humans are like. And I would say, if you want to say that humans are, by nature, equal, no matter their race, class, distinctions, whatever, if you want to say that humans are by their nature equal, you're already making a quite theological claim about what they're like. How do you respond to that?
To me, it's immaterial whether it's a theological claim or not. I'm interested in practicality in this particular instance, right? Mm-hmm. And even, the fact is, the statement you just made about human beings are equal is completely untrue. And we know this as we observe the world. People are not equal. So to me, the bigger part of this is we don't know what we mean by equal, right?
Yep.
That's the real problem. Look, I have no problem with the argument that the reason that Western societies developed the idea of equality, which that is to say that all human beings deserve dignity and so on, is because of Christianity. I'm no opponent of Christianity or a critic or anything like that. So I'm happy to accept that. I'm just thinking about the society we live in now, in which people are mostly not religious and increasingly so. How do we retain social cohesion? And how do we challenge some of these terrible ideas about, essentially, that are designed to embed a completely, they're designed to undermine the idea of equality, in my view. We talked about it earlier, wokeness. How do we challenge that effectively, including when speaking to people who are not religious and are unlikely to become religious? Yeah. Does that make sense?
It totally does. And I think, so I wrote a book last year. Interestingly, you said about the 7 laws of secular morality. Interestingly, I dive into 7 values that we tend to take for granted in a secular liberal democracy. I talk about equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. as things that we already believe. And I think step one, whether people end up coming to church or not, I do think step one is to make people understand the profoundly gut-level, intuitive, belief-driven level that we argue these things about. Because, as you absolutely rightly said, empirically speaking, do we notice equality? You know, can you put it into a test tube and do a test on two different human beings to find out their equality? You can't really. Are any of these moral intuitions empirically grounded? Actually, they're not.
They're not.
No. But they are beliefs, and therefore I would question, Konstantin, yourself, whether you are a pure empiricist in that sense. I would say that you have gut-level intuitions by which you navigate the world, and it's just worth figuring out historically where they came from. And as you say, you know, there's the Tom Holland thesis. Yes, it's come from Christianity, and I'm on board with that. And then I'd also want to press into the logical derivation of these things, that it's not because I'm a highly evolved ape, therefore I have human rights. It's that this is what humans are actually like. And so I'm not trying to make people take a leap of faith. I want to point out the fact that they're already midair, and I think there's some ground that needs to go beneath your feet that actually grounds those beliefs. Does that kind of make sense?
It does, and I can see why it would make sense from your perspective. What I'm saying to you, of course I have gut-level intuitions and everything, and I am a product of my time, right? And a product of the environment that I grew up in. So, and that in my case, the environment of growing up in Russia and in the UK, both of those are or were at least Christian countries predominantly until recently. So to some extent, my worldview will have been influenced by that. I'm just saying that in terms of my own work and what I'm thinking about going forward is, I believe a vision is needed. This is one of the reasons I think Jordan Peterson was very effective, particularly at the beginning, where he talked about religious or religiously derived values and the stories that come from Holy Scripture, without making it about a belief in God, right? It was much more about what are the useful lessons of this, and what are the useful things to you. And I think in the society that we live in now, I just see a lot of people who are looking for answers, but the religious door is not one through which they have any intention of walking. So the question for me is, okay, let's go in through the religious door. Let's take the useful stuff and at least give them that. Otherwise, we're going to be in a really bad place really, really quickly.
Yeah. No, I totally get on board with that. And that's where I'm sort of coming from in my book, The Air We Breathe. So, yeah, pointing out things like equality. They are not empirically based. They are belief based. Mm-hmm. What are the foundations? Perhaps we could take a different one. Freedom of speech, for instance, as something that's very sort of dear to your heart. I think that presupposes a difference between words and violence.
It does. Which,
interestingly, Alex O'Connor pressed into with you recently on his channel, Cosmic Skeptic, an atheist YouTuber and blogger and podcaster. So he made the point that I'm often making as well, that if there is no if we don't have souls, and if there's no such thing as that level to reality, but it's all a physical reality, then at bottom, there isn't anything different between the neurological firings in my brain when you call me a nasty name, or the neurological firings in my brain when you slap me across the cheek. Therefore, the distinction between words and violence collapses, doesn't it? Yeah. How do you reflect on that?
Well, I'll say to you the same thing I said to Alex, which is I don't think that's true. The neurochemical reaction you have to being called a word is something over which you have control. The pain you feel when I slap you in the face is not something over which you feel control, where you have control. Now, a lot of people feel that because someone said something offensive to them or something to them that they think is offensive, that their reaction is involuntary, but it's really not. If you change the way you think, you will experience those things differently. You can't really do that with physical with physical things. So I don't really buy that argument particularly.
Would you say there's a difference between persuasion and coercion, isn't there? That, you know, words are all we have in this sense of healthy dialogue and debate that changes minds. That is a very different thing to forcing someone to do something either just financially or with the threat of violence. We're talking very different things, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at that stage, I think we're tapping into something quite interesting about, Jesus said, "Put away your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword." And here's someone who then, in the New Testament, says, go and spread the gospel through the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And obviously the Dark Ages were a very mixed a very mixed experiment in how the church was meant to forward its ends via persuasion and not via violence, and the Spanish Inquisition and Crusades and things like that are horrendous exceptions to the rule. But they're kind of the exceptions that prove that there is a rule, that we hate the idea of compelled belief, and we feel very strongly that persuasion is the way to forward your ends and not violence. And again, I just wonder whether that presses into there's something different between what the Bible would call logos and word, and something and the flesh and the material reality, and that we kind of know we need to prioritize the one over the other. And I'm not go on.
But I'm not an atheist, and I never have been, and so the idea that the soul exists isn't controversial to me.
Yeah.
My view is. I'm quite a spiritual person. I've experienced all sorts of really incredibly non-embodied, physiologically inexplicable things in my life. So I'm not. I certainly would never claim that. We're just physical animals and we have no soul at all.
That's interesting. And so, when you talk about it's difficult for secular people to get on board with the idea of God, what are you thinking about if you hear a Christian like me say God? What does that sort of mean to you, and what might be the resistance to that?
That's a good question. What do I think about? I mean, the cartoon version is the old man in the sky.
Right.
That's the cartoon version. But I suppose, to a certain extent, that there is an entity with some kind of intentionality that created the world and everyone in it, and that's sort of sitting up there evaluating, sort of nodding, not nodding, but wagging its finger as you watch porn late at night or whatever. You know what I mean? Like that sort of. Like sort of right, wrong, bad, judging you from that perspective.
Yeah. And that's always my next question. When if somebody ever says to me they don't believe in God, my next question is, well, which God don't you believe in? And they end up describing some kind of distant individual, high on power, low on personality, Zeus, basically, with a thunderbolt ready to hurl. And I kind of say, well, I
don't know about the thunderbolt, but the rest of it,
the rest, yeah. As though God is kind of a super being within the created order. And at that stage, I always sort of think, if Hamlet ever wondered where Shakespeare was, you've got two different answers to Hamlet. If Hamlet's like, where is Shakespeare? I don't believe in Shakespeare. Show me Shakespeare. Like, one answer is Shakespeare is actually nowhere in your universe. And another answer is Shakespeare is your universe. In him you live and move and have your being. And I think that's a line from. So
how does the universe have a sun that it sends down into itself to spread a certain message and to die for the sins of the people that it's created?
So imagine that Shakespeare wanted to make himself known to Hamlet. He could write himself into the play as William Shakespeare. And, Do you not
think it's quite a weird thing for Shakespeare to do, though?
Apparently it's happened. So Dorothy Sayers did this in a detective novel. She sort of fell in love with her protagonist and decided to write herself into the story so they could actually meet.
Yeah.
And explain that. So I think when you do create something, you have that kind of sense. And I often think people who tell stories are creators of worlds already. And there's a number of things that follow from that. One is that no one has ever created a world without suffering and sorrow. Like you tell a story in which there's a bright kingdom and then the dragon comes and steals somebody away, and there's the dark clouds and storm and chaos, and maybe the hero steps forward and wins the day through struggle. Like every story we've ever told actually has a shape to it, a little bit like what you just said. That there is a fall, that there is through love a hero who comes and wins the day through struggle and sacrifice. And I guess that, the Christian story is that the author writes himself in as the central hero, and through love brings about the happily ever after, and that's why the stories that resonate with us have that kind of shape to them. I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
Well, what I would say is that those stories take that shape because that's human nature. And actually, a lot of that story, I mean, there's a debate, in my opinion, to be had about which of those stories is more accurate. The sort of Game of Thrones universe.
Right. Yes.
Or the more sort of triumph of adversity story. Which one of those is,
Lord of the Rings. Yeah.
That's right. Perfect metaphor.
Yeah.
I don't know which one of those is historically more true. When I look at my own life experience, for example, growing up in late Soviet Union, early 90s Russia, that was much more of a Game of Thrones world than a Lord of the Rings. And the world I observe around me is much more Game of Thrones than Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
So to some extent, I would argue that shape of story is so appealing to human beings precisely because it's not true, but it speaks to our dreams and aspirations about the world that we would like to see, and it encourages us to be the best version of ourselves in the hope that world can someday be created, or at least we can get closer to it.
And even as you give that account of things, you've kind of done a Lord of the Rings thing there. That kind of through struggle, we can get somewhere better than we were.
That's right. That's why we like those stories, I think. So,
yes.
The divine element of it doesn't seem to me, forgive me, to be necessary.
Yeah. It reminds me very much of Derren Brown. He was once asked about his magic and why his magic is so compelling, and he's a showman as much as he is a magician. And he said so much magic is boring because it tells the God story, and the God story is you're in trouble with a snap of the fingers, everything comes up roses, and you take a bow, and that's not very interesting. He said the kind of magic I like to do is I like to tell the hero story. And the hero story is everything looks like it's falling apart, and there's no hope whatsoever, and then the protagonist shows up and then brings about this wonderful catastrophe that brings all things back right again. And in the nick of time, everything, works out, and there's a happily ever after. That's the hero story. And I remember listening to Derren Brown, who's gone on an interesting spiritual journey himself, but from belief to atheism. But I just listened to that, and I want to say, what if the God story is the hero story? And I guess and the Christian message is, the God who's worth bothering about is not the Zeus figure on high. The God who's worth bothering about is the hero who incarnates, descends down to the deepest depths, gives himself for the life of the world, and in struggle is moving things towards a happily ever after. And I think to the degree that we resonate with that, I think we're resonating with God. And it might not be the God that we thought of as the bearded individual who's far away. It is the human condition. I love what you said, Konstantin, about it's what resonates with people is not so much the idea of God. And if by God people mean a distant individual, I can completely understand. What is most close to us is the human condition. And I think, in Christ, what you've got is the God who becomes man, and he's the sort of man who kind of resonates with us. And I wonder, have you had a look into the Jesus stories, read the Gospels, that kind of thing? And if so,
not since I was very young.
Yeah. That would be.
Is this a live conversion? Is this what you got me on the show for? Just to see,
the
just
conversion
to see
of Constantine. Yeah.
Well, Constantine was, of course, the emperor who brought Christianity to the Roman Empire.
Exactly.
So
312.
You want me to follow in his footsteps? I take it.
I do, just for the clicks, obviously. Just for the clicks.
That would get a lot of views if I could convert live on air. No, this is all very interesting. And look, by the way, the conception of God that you were talking about, which is God being the universe in which we all exist, that isn't really particularly counter to the way that I experience or think of the world. The other stuff in which human beings get involved, the sort of more organized religion side of it, that's where I have, that's the bit I find a lot less appealing.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes. Yeah. And I totally get into that in the book. I think that when we tend to think of the church, we think of something that is unequal, coercive, cruel, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive. Which interestingly though is using those same 7 values as our kind of starting point. So I can totally understand how organized religion has not covered itself in glory in lots of ways. But Konstantin, you've written this book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. What are you hoping that it does?
Well, it's been out for a while now, so I'm actually working on a second book, which is going to be called Gratitude. So this is going to get your juices flowing.
Absolutely.
Straight away, I imagine. So the first book was really, one of my frustrations to some extent with the first book was about the fact that I wrote a book expressing genuinely a very deep appreciation for everything we have in the West and trying to remind people why it's worth preserving and protecting. But in many ways, it was quite a negative book, despite that. There was a lot of criticism of where we're going wrong. And, that's not unnecessary and not unhealthy in and of itself. But what I really want to talk about now is the journey of recognizing and accepting our own mistakes and those of others in our lives, and those mistakes that were made by the people for whose crimes we're now supposed to apparently answer, our ancestors, and how do you recognize and accept those and move on without this endless self-flagellation and nihilism and self-loathing, which I think the West is becoming infected with. So that's really what I'm interested in right now, is how do we remember that what we have is really genuinely wonderful, and how do we be grateful for it? Because, my experience is gratitude is such a powerful thing that when you engage in it, you end up in a better place, and then you have more things to be grateful for.
I love it. So the future is post-woke, when we are grateful and full of wonder, and forgiveness is woven in. I can see where you're headed, Konstantin. It's
to God, to Jesus. Is that where I'm headed?
But Konstantin, you've been really generous with your time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And hope people go and subscribe to the Triggernometry channel if they haven't already. I'm sure they are. But Konstantin Kisin, thank you for joining us.
Glenn, really appreciate it. Thank you for having me.